85 on stories. It is astonishing how little attention critics have paid to story considered in itself. Granted, the story, the style in which it should be told, the order in which it should be disposed and, above all, the delineation of the characters, have been abundantly discussed. But the story itself, the series of imagined events, is nearly always passed over in silence, or else treated exclusively as affording opportunities for the delineation of character. There are indeed three notable exceptions. Aristotle in the Poetica constructed a theory of Greek tragedy which puts story in the center and relegates character to a strictly subordinate place. In the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, Boccaccio and others developed an allegorical theory of story to explain the ancient myths. And in our own time Jung and his followers have produced their doctrine of archetypes. Apart from these three attempts, the subject has been left almost untouched, and this has had a curious result. Those forms of literature in which story exists merely as a means to something else, for example, the novel of manners where the story is there for the sake of the characters, or the criticism of social conditions, have had full justice done to them, but those forms in which everything else is there for the sake of the story have been given little serious attention. Not only have they been despised, as if they were fit only for children, but even the kind of pleasure they give has, in my opinion, been misunderstood. It is the second injustice which I am most anxious to remedy. Perhaps the pleasure of story comes as low in the scale as modern criticism puts it. I do not think so myself, but on that point we may agree to differ. Let us, however, try to see clearly what kind of pleasure it is, or, rather, what different kinds of pleasure it may be. For I suspect that a very hasty assumption has been made on this subject. I think that books which are read merely for the story may be enjoyed in two very different ways. It is partly a division of books. Some stories can be read only in the one spirit and some only in the other, and partly a division of readers. The same story can be read in different ways. What finally convinced me of this distinction was a conversation which I had a few years ago with an intelligent American pupil. We were talking about the books which had delighted our boyhood. His favorite had been Fenimore Cooper whom, as it happens, I have never read. My friend described one particular scene in which the hero was half sleeping by his bivouac fire in the woods while a redskin with a tomahawk was silently creeping on him from behind. He remembered the breathless excitement with which he had read the passage, the agonized suspense with which he wondered whether the hero would wake up in time or not. But I, remembering the great moments in my own early reading, felt quite sure that my friend was misinterpreting his experience, and indeed leaving out the real point. Surely, I thought, the sheer excitement, the suspense, was not what had kept him going back in bed to Fenimore Cooper. If that were what he wanted, any other boy's blood would have done as well. I tried to put my thought into words. I asked him whether he were sure that he was not overemphasizing and falsely isolating the importance of the danger simply as danger. For though I had never read Fenimore Cooper, I had enjoyed other books about Red Indians. And I knew that what I wanted from them was not simply excitement. Dangers, of course, there must be. How else can you keep a story going? But they must, in the mood which led one to such a book, be redskin dangers. The redskinnery was what really mattered. In such a scene as my friend had described, take away the feathers, the high cheekbones, the whiskered trousers, substitute a pistol for a tomahawk, and what would be left? For I wanted not the momentary suspense but that whole world to which it belonged, the snow and the snowshoes, beavers and canoes, warpaths and wigwams, and Hiawatha names. Thus and then came the shock. My pupil is a very clear-eyed man and he saw at once what I meant and also saw how totally his imaginative life as a boy had differed from mine. He replied that he was perfectly certain that all that had made no part of his pleasure. He had never cared one brass farthing for it. Indeed, and this really made me feel as if I were talking to a visitor from another planet, insofar as he had been dimly aware of all that, he had resented it as a distraction from the main issue. He would, if anything, have preferred to the redskin some more ordinary danger such as a crook with a revolver. To those whose literary experiences are at all like my own, the distinction which I am trying to make between two kinds of pleasure will probably be clear enough from this one example. But to make it doubly clear I will add another. I was once taken to see a film version of King Solomon's Mines. Of its many sins, not least the introduction of a totally irrelevant young woman in shorts who accompanied the three adventurers wherever they went, only one here concerns us. At the end of Haggad's book, as everyone remembers, the heroes are awaiting death entombed in a rock chamber and surrounded by the mummified kings of that land. The maker of the film version, however, apparently thought this tame. He substituted a subterranean volcanic eruption, and then went one better by adding an earthquake. Perhaps we should not blame him. Perhaps the scene in the original was not cinematic and the man was right, by the canons of his own art, in altering it. But it would have been better not to have chosen in the first place a story which could be adapted to the screen only by being ruined. Ruined, at least, for me. No doubt if sheer excitement is all you want from a story, and if increase in dangers increases excitement, then a rapidly changing series of two risks, that of being burned alive and that of being crushed to bits, would be better than a single prolonged danger of starving to death in a cave. But that is just the point. There must be a pleasure in such stories distinct from mere excitement, or I should not feel that I had been cheated in being given the earthquake instead of Haggad's actual scene. What I lose is the whole sense of the deathly, quite a different thing from simple danger of death, the cold, the silence, and the surrounding faces of the ancient, the crowned and sceptered, dead. You may, if you please, say that writer Haggad's effect is quite as crude or vulgar or sensational as that which the film substituted for it. I am not at present discussing that. The point is that it is extremely different. The one lays a hushing spell on the imagination, the other excites a rapid flutter of the nerves. In reading that chapter of the book, curiosity or suspense about the escape of the heroes from their death trap makes a very minor part of one's experience. The trap I remember forever, how they got out I have long since forgotten. It seems to me that in talking of books which are mere stories, books, that is, which concern themselves principally with the imagined event and not with character or society, nearly everyone makes the assumption that excitement is the only pleasure they ever give or are intended to give. Excitement, in this sense, may be defined as the alternate tension and appeasement of imagined anxiety. This is what I think untrue. In some such books, and for some readers, another factor comes in. To put it at the very lowest, I know that something else comes in for at least one reader, myself. I must here be autobiographical for the sake of being evidential. Here is a man who has spent more hours than he cares to remember in reading romances, and received from them more pleasure perhaps than he should. I know the geography of Torments better than that of Tellus. I have been more curious about travels from uplands to Utterbol and from Morna Morna to Coster Balorn than about those recorded in Hakluyt. Though I saw the trenches before Eris, I could not now lecture on them so tactically as on the Greek wall, and Scamander, and the Skin Gate. As a social historian I am sounder on Toad Hall in the Wildwood or the cave-dwelling Selenites or Hrothgar's Court or Vortigern's than on London, Oxford, and Belfast. If to love story is to love excitement, then I ought to be the greatest lover of excitement alive. But the fact is that what is said to be the most exciting novel in the world, The Three Musketeers, makes no appeal to me at all. The total lack of atmosphere repels me. There is no country in the book, save as a storehouse of inns and ambushes. There is no weather. When they cross to London there is no feeling that London differs from Paris. There is not a moment's rest from the adventures, one's nose is kept ruthlessly to the grindstone. It all means nothing to me. If that is what is meant by romance, then romance is my aversion and I greatly prefer George Eliot or Trollope. In saying this I am not attempting to criticize The Three Musketeers. I believe on the testimony of others that it is a capital story. I am sure that my own inability to like it is in me a defect and a misfortune. But that misfortune is evidence. If a man sensitive and perhaps oversensitive to romance likes least that romance which is, by common consent, the most exciting of all, then it follows that excitement is not the only kind of pleasure to be got out of romance. If a man loves wine and yet hates one of the strongest wines, then surely the sole source of pleasure in wine cannot be the alcohol? If I am alone in this experience then, to be sure, the present essay is of merely autobiographical interest. But I am pretty sure that I am not absolutely alone. I write on the chance that some others may feel the same and in the hope that I may help them to clarify their own sensations. In the example of King Solomon's Mines, the producer of the film substituted at the climax one kind of danger for another and thereby, for me, ruined the story. But where excitement is the only thing that matters, kinds of danger must be relevant. Only degrees of danger will matter. The greater the danger and the narrower the hero's escape from it, the more exciting the story will be. But when we are concerned with the something else, this is not so. Different kinds of danger strike different chords from the imagination. Even in real life, different kinds of danger produce different kinds of fear. There may come a point at which fear is so great that such distinctions vanish, but that is another matter. There is a fear which is twin sister to awe, such as a man in wartime feels when he first comes within sound of the guns. There is a fear which is twin sister to disgust, such as a man feels on finding a snake or scorpion in his bedroom. There are taut, quivering fears, for one split second hardly distinguishable from a kind of pleasurable thrill, that a man may feel on a dangerous horse or a dangerous sea, and again, dead, squashed, flattened, numbing fears, as when we think we have cancer or cholera. There are also fears which are not of danger at all, like the fear of some large and hideous, though innocuous, insect, or the fear of a ghost. All this, even in real life. But in imagination, where the fear does not rise to abject terror and is not discharged in action, the qualitative difference is much stronger. I can never remember a time when it was not, however vaguely, present to my consciousness. Jack the Giant Killer is not, in essence, simply the story of a clever hero surmounting danger. It is in essence the story of such a hero surmounting danger from giants. It is quite easy to contrive a story in which, though the enemies are of normal size, the odds against Jack are equally great. But it will be quite a different story. The whole quality of the imaginative response is determined by the fact that the enemies are giants. That heaviness, that monstrosity, that uncouthness, hangs over the whole thing. Turn it into music and you will feel the difference at once. If your villain is a giant, your orchestra will proclaim his entrance in one way, if he is any other kind of villain, in another. I have seen landscapes, notably in the Mourne Mountains, which, under a particular light, made me feel that at any moment a giant might raise his head over the next ridge. Nature has that in her which compels us to invent giants, and only giants will do. Notice that Gawain was in the northwest corner of England when Eddins and Eilidh him, giants came blowing after him on the high fells. Can it be an accident that Wordsworth was in the same places when he heard low breedings coming after him? The dangerousness of the giants is, though important, secondary. In some folk tales we meet giants who are not dangerous, but they still affect us in much the same way. A good giant is legitimate, but he would be 20 tons of living, earth-shaking oxymoron. The intolerable pressure, the sense of something older, wilder, and more earthy than humanity, would still cleave to him. But let us descend to a lower instance. Are pirates, any more than giants, merely for threatening the hero? That sail which is rapidly overhauling us may be an ordinary enemy, a Don or a Frenchman. The ordinary enemy may easily be made just as lethal as the pirate. At the moment when she runs up the Jolly Roger, what exactly does this do to the imagination? It means, I grant you, that if we are beaten there will be no quarter. But that could be contrived without piracy. It is not the mere increase of danger that does the trick. It is the whole image of the utterly lawless enemy, the men who have cut adrift from all human society and become, as it were, a species of their own, men strangely clad, dark men with earrings, men with a history which they know and we don't, lords of unspecified treasure in undiscovered islands. They are, in fact, to the young reader almost as mythological as the giants. It does not cross his mind that a man, a mere man like the rest of us, might be a pirate at one time of his life and not at another, or that there is any smudgy frontier between piracy and privateering. A pirate is a pirate, just as a giant is a giant. Consider, again, the enormous difference between being shut out and being shut in, if you like, between agoraphobia and claustrophobia. In King Solomon's Mines the heroes were shut in, so, more terribly, the narrator imagined himself to be in post-premature burial. Your breath shortens while you read it. Now remember the chapter called Mr. Bedford Alone in H.G. Wells's First Men in the Moon. There Bedford finds himself shut out on the surface of the moon just as the long lunar day is drawing to its close, and with the day go the air in all heat. Read it from the terrible moment when the first tiny snowflake startles him into a realization of his position down to the point at which he reaches the sphere and is saved. Then ask yourself whether what you have been feeling is simply suspense. Over me, around me, closing in on me, embracing me ever nearer was the eternal, the infinite and final night of space. That is the idea which has kept you enthralled. But if we were concerned only with the question whether Mr. Bedford will live or freeze, the idea is quite beside the purpose. You can die of cold between Russian Poland and New Poland, just as well as by going to the moon, and the pain will be equal. For the purpose of killing Mr. Bedford, the infinite and final night of space is almost entirely ogios. What is by cosmic standards an infinitesimal change of temperature is sufficient to kill a man, and absolute zero can do no more. That airless outer darkness is important not for what it can do to Bedford but for what it does to us, to trouble us with Pascal's old fear of those eternal silences which have knotted so much religious faith and shattered so many humanistic hopes, to evoke with them and through them all our racial and childish memories of exclusion and desolation, to present, in fact, as an institution one permanent aspect of human experience. And here, I expect, we come to one of the differences between life and art. A man really in Bedford's position would probably not feel very acutely that sidereal loneliness. The immediate issue of death would drive the contemplative object out of his mind. He would have no interest in the many degrees of increasing cold lower than the one which made his survival impossible. That is one of the functions of art, to present what the narrow and desperately practical perspectives of real life exclude. I have sometimes wondered whether the excitement may not be an element actually hostile to the deeper imagination. In inferior romances, such as the American magazines of science fiction supply, we often come across a really suggestive idea. But the author has no expedient for keeping the story on the move except that of putting his hero into violent danger. In the hurry and scurry of his escapes the poetry of the basic idea is lost. In a much milder degree I think this has happened to Wells himself in The War of the Worlds. What really matters in this story is the idea of being attacked by something utterly outside. As in Piers Plowman, destruction has come upon us from the planets. If the Martian invaders are merely dangerous, if we once become mainly concerned with the fact that they can kill us, why, then, a burglar or a basilisk can do as much. The real nerve of the romance is laid bare when the hero first goes to look at the newly fallen projectile on Horsell Common. The yellowish-white metal that gleamed in the crack between the lid and the cylinder had an unfamiliar hue. Extraterrestrial had no meaning for most of the onlookers. But extraterrestrial is the key word of the whole story. And in the later horrors, excellently as they are done, we lose the feeling of it. Similarly in the poet laureate Sard Harker it is the journey across the Sierras that really matters. That the man who has heard that noise in the cannon, he could not think what it was. It was not sorrowful nor joyful nor terrible. It was great and strange. It was like the rock speaking, that this man should be later in danger of mere murder is almost an impertinence. It is here that Homer shows his supreme excellence. The landing on Circe's island, the sight of the smoke going up from amidst those unexplored woods, the god meeting us, the messenger, the slayer of Argus, what an anticlimax if all these had been the prelude only to some ordinary risk of life and limb. But the peril that lurks here, the silent, painless, unendurable change into brutality, is worthy of the setting. M.R. de la Mare too has surmounted the difficulty. The thread launched in the opening paragraph of his best stories is seldom fulfilled in any identifiable event, still less is it dissipated. Our fears are never, in one sense, realized, yet we lay down the story feeling that they, and far more, were justified. But perhaps the most remarkable achievement in this kind is that of Mr. David Lindsay's Voyage to Arcturus. The experienced reader, noting the threats and promises of the opening chapter, even while he gratefully enjoys them, feels sure that they cannot be carried out. He reflects that in stories of this kind the first chapter is nearly always the best and reconciles himself to disappointment, torments, when we reach it, he forebodes, will be less interesting than torments seen from the earth. But never will he have been more mistaken. Unaided by any special skill or even any sound taste in language, the author leads us up a stair of unpredictables. In each chapter we think we have found his final position, each time we are utterly mistaken. He builds whole worlds of imagery and passion, any one of which would have served another writer for a whole book, only to pull each of them to pieces and pour scorn on it. The physical dangers, which are plentiful, here count for nothing. It is we ourselves and the author who walk through a world of spiritual dangers which makes them seem trivial. There is no recipe for writing of this kind. But part of the secret is that the author, like Kafka, is recording a lived dialectic. His torments is a region of the spirit. He is the first writer to discover what other planets are really good for in fiction. No merely physical strangeness or merely spatial distance will realize that idea of otherness which is what we are always trying to grasp in a story about voyaging through space. You must go into another dimension. To construct plausible and moving other worlds you must draw on the only real other world we know, that of the spirit. Notice here the corollary. If some fatal progress of applied science ever enables us in fact to reach the moon, that real journey will not at all satisfy the impulse which we now seek to gratify by writing such stories. The real moon, if you could reach it and survive, would in a deep and deadly sense be just like anywhere else. You would find cold, hunger, hardship, and danger, and after the first few hours they would be simply cold, hunger, hardship, and danger as you might have met them on Earth. And death would be simply death among those bleached craters as it is simply death in a nursing home at Sheffield. No man would find an abiding strangeness on the moon unless he were the sort of man who could find it in his own back garden. He who would bring home the wealth of the Indies must carry the wealth of the Indies with him. Good stories often introduce the marvelous or supernatural, and nothing about story has been so often misunderstood as this. Thus, for example, Dr. Johnson, if I remember rightly, thought that children liked stories of the marvelous because they were too ignorant to know that they were impossible. But children do not always like them, nor are those who like them always children, and to enjoy reading about fairies, much more about giants and dragons, it is not necessary to believe in them. Belief is at best irrelevant, it may be a positive disadvantage. Nor are the marvels in good story ever mere arbitrary fiction stuck on to make the narrative more sensational. I happened to remark to a man who was sitting beside me at dinner the other night that I was reading Grimm in German of an evening but never bothered to look up a word I didn't know, so that it is often great fun, I added, guessing what it was that the old woman gave to the prince which he afterwards lost in the wood. And specially difficult in a fairy tale, said he, where everything is arbitrary and therefore the object might be anything at all. His error was profound. The logic of a fairy tale is as strict as that of a realistic novel, though different. Does anyone believe that Kenneth Graham made an arbitrary choice when he gave his principal character the form of a toad, or that a stag, a pigeon, a lion, would have done as well? The choice is based on the fact that the real toad's face has a grotesque resemblance to a certain kind of human face, a rather apoplectic face with a fatuous grin on it. This is, no doubt, an accident in the sense that all the lines which suggest the resemblance are really there for quite different biological reasons. The ludicrous quasi-human expression is therefore changeless. The toad cannot stop grinning because its grin is not really a grin at all. Looking at the creature we thus see, isolated and fixed, an aspect of human vanity in its funniest and most pardonable form, following that hint Graham creates Mr. Toad, an ultra-Johnsonian humor. And we bring back the wealth of the Indies, we have henceforward more amusement in, and kindness towards, a certain kind of vanity in real life. But why should the characters be disguised as animals at all? The disguise is very thin, so thin that Graham makes Mr. Toad on one occasion comb the dry leaves out of his hair. Yet it is quite indispensable. If you try to rewrite the book with all the characters humanized you are faced at the outset with a dilemma. Are they to be adults or children? You will find that they can be neither. They are like children insofar as they have no responsibilities, no struggle for existence, no domestic cares. Meals turn up, one does not even ask who cooked them. In Mr. Badger's kitchen plates on the dresser grinned at pots on the shelf. Who kept them clean? Where were they bought? How were they delivered in the wild wood? Mole is very snug in his subterranean home, but what was he living on? If he is a Ronquet, where is the bank? What are his investments? The tables in his forecourt were marked with rings that hinted at beer mugs. But where did he get the beer? In that way the life of all the characters is that of children for whom everything is provided and who take everything for granted. But in other ways it is the life of adults. They go where they like and do what they please, they arrange their own lives. To that extent the book is a specimen of the most scandalous escapism. It paints a happiness under incompatible conditions, the sort of freedom we can only have in childhood and the sort we can only have in maturity, and conceals the contradiction by the further pretense that the characters are not human beings at all. The one absurdity helps to hide the other. It might be expected that such a book would unfit us for the harshness of reality and send us back to our daily lives unsettled and discontented. I do not find that it does so. The happiness which it presents to us is in fact full of the simplest and most attainable things: food, sleep, exercise, friendship, the face of nature, even, in a sense, religion. That simple but sustaining meal of bacon and broad beans and a macaroni pudding which Rat gave to his friends has, I doubt not, helped down many a real nursery dinner. And in the same way the whole story, paradoxically enough, strengthens our relish for real life. This excursion into the preposterous sends us back with renewed pleasure to the actual. It is usual to speak in a playfully apologetic tone about one's adult enjoyment of what are called children's books. I think the convention a silly one. No book is really worth reading at the age of 10 which is not equally, and often far more, worth reading at the age of 50 except, of course, books of information. The only imaginative works we ought to grow out of are those which it would have been better not to have read at all. A mature palate will probably not much care for creme de menthe, but it ought still to enjoy bread and butter and honey. Another very large class of stories turns on fulfilled prophecies, the story of Oedipus, or the man who would be king, or the Hobbit. In most of them the very steps taken to prevent the fulfillment of the prophecy actually bring it about. It is foretold that Oedipus will kill his father and marry his mother. In order to prevent this from happening he is exposed on the mountain, and that exposure, by leading to his rescue and thus to his life among strangers in ignorance of his real parentage, renders possible both the disasters. Such stories produce, at least in me, a feeling of awe, coupled with a certain sort of bewilderment such as one often feels in looking at a complex pattern of lines that pass over and under one another. One sees, yet does not quite see, the regularity. And is there not good occasion both for awe and bewilderment? We have just had set before our imagination something that has always baffled the intellect. We have seen how destiny and free will can be combined, even how free will is the modus operandi of destiny. The story does what no theorem can quite do. It may not be like real life in the superficial sense, but it sets before us an image of what reality may well be like at some more central region. It will be seen that throughout this essay I have taken my examples indiscriminately from books which critics would, quite rightly, place in very different categories, from American scientific fiction in Homer, from Sophocles and Merton, from children's stories and the intensely sophisticated art of M. R. de la Mare. This does not mean that I think them of equal literary merit. But if I am right in thinking that there is another enjoyment in story besides the excitement, then popular romance even on the lowest level becomes rather more important than we had supposed. When you see an immature or uneducated person devouring what seem to you merely sensational stories, can you be sure what kind of pleasure he is enjoying? It is of course, no good asking him. If he were capable of analyzing his own experience as the question requires him to do, he would be neither uneducated nor immature. But because he is inarticulate we must not give judgment against him. He may be seeking only the recurring tension of imagined anxiety. But he may also, I believe, be receiving certain profound experiences which are, for him, not acceptable in any other form. Mr. Roger Lancelyn Green, writing in English not long ago, remarked that the reading of Rider Haggard has been to many a sort of religious experience. To some people this will have seemed simply grotesque. I myself would strongly disagree with it if religious is taken to mean Christian. And even if we take it in a sub-Christian sense, it would have been safer to say that such people had first met in Haggard's romances elements which they would meet again in religious experience if they ever came to have any. But I think Mr. Green is very much nearer the mark than those who assume that no one has ever read the romances except in order to be thrilled by hairbreadth escapes. If he had said simply that something which the educated receive from poetry can reach the masses through stories of adventure, and almost in no other way, then I think he would have been right. If so, nothing can be more disastrous than the view that the cinema can and should replace popular written fiction. The elements which it excludes are precisely those which give the untrained mind its only access to the imaginative world. There is death in the camera. As I have admitted, it is very difficult to tell in any given case whether a story is piercing to the unliterary reader's deeper imagination or only exciting his emotions. You cannot tell even by reading the story for yourself. Its badness proves very little. The more imagination the reader has, being an untrained reader, the more he will do for himself. He will, at a mere hint from the author, flood wretched material with suggestion and never guess that he is himself chiefly making what he enjoys. The nearest we can come to a test is by asking whether he often rereads the same story. It is, of course, a good test for every reader of every kind of book. An unliterary man may be defined as one who reads books once only. There is hope for a man who has never read Mallory or Boswell or Tristram Shandy or Shakespeare's sonnets, but what can you do with a man who says he has read them, meaning he has read them once, and thinks that this settles the matter? Yet I think the test has a special application to the matter in hand. For excitement, in the sense defined above, is just what must disappear from a second reading. You cannot, except at the first reading, be really curious about what happened. If you find that the reader of popular romance, however uneducated a reader, however bad the romances, goes back to his old favorites again and again, then you have pretty good evidence that they are to him a sort of poetry. The rereader is looking not for actual surprises, which can come only once, but for a certain surprisingness. The point has often been misunderstood. The man in Peacock thought that he had disposed of surprise as an element in landscape gardening when he asked what happened if you walked through the garden for the second time. Wiseacre. In the only sense that matters, the surprise works as well the 20th time as the first. It is the quality of unexpectedness, not the fact that delights us. It is even better the second time. Knowing that the surprise is coming, we can now fully relish the fact that this path through the shrubbery doesn't look as if it were suddenly going to bring us out on the edge of the cliff. So in literature, we do not enjoy a story fully at the first reading. Not till the curiosity, the sheer narrative lust, has been given its sop and laid asleep, are we at leisure to savor the real beauties. Till then, it is like wasting great wine on a ravenous natural thirst which merely wants cold wetness. The children understand this well when they ask for the same story over and over again, and in the same words. They want to have again the surprise of discovering that what seemed Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother is really the wolf. It is better when you know it is coming. Free from the shock of actual surprise, you can attend better to the intrinsic surprisingness of the peripeteia. I should like to be able to believe that I am here in a very small way contributing, for criticism does not always come later than practice, to the encouragement of a better school of prose story in England, a story that can mediate imaginative life to the masses while not being contemptible to the few. But perhaps this is not very likely. It must be admitted that the art of story as I see it is a very difficult one. What its central difficulty is I have already hinted when I complained that in the War of the Worlds the idea that really matters becomes lost or blunted as the story gets underway. I must now add that there is a perpetual danger of this happening in all stories. To be stories at all they must be series of events, but it must be understood that the series, the plot, as we call it, is only really a net whereby to catch something else. The real theme may be, and perhaps usually is, something that has no sequence in it, something other than a process and much more like a state or quality. Giant ship, otherness, the desolation of space, are examples that have crossed our path. The titles of some stories illustrate the point very well. The Well at the World's End. Can a man write a story to that title? Can he find a series of events following one another in time which will really catch and fix and bring home to us all that we grasp at on merely hearing the 6 words? Can a man write a story on Atlantis, or is it better to leave the word to work on its own? And I must confess that the net very seldom does succeed in catching the bird. Morris in The Well at the World's End came near to success, quite near enough to make the book worth many readings. Yet, after all, the best moments of it come in the first half. But it does sometimes succeed. In the works of the late E.R. Edison it succeeds completely. You may like or dislike his invented worlds. I myself like that of the worm Ouroboros and strongly dislike that of Mistress of Mistresses, but there is here no quarrel between the theme and the articulation of the story. Every episode, every speech, helps to incarnate what the author is imagining. You could spare none of them. It takes the whole story to build up that strange blend of Renaissance luxury and northern hardness. The secret here is largely the style, and especially the style of the dialogue. These proud, reckless, amorous people create themselves in the whole atmosphere of their world chiefly by talking. M.R. de la Mare also succeeds, partly by style and partly by never laying the cards on the table. Mr. David Lindsay, however, succeeds while writing a style which is at times, to be frank, abominable. He succeeds because his real theme is, like the plot, sequential, a thing in time, or quasi-time, a passionate spiritual journey. Charles Williams had the same advantage, but I do not mention his stories much here because they are hardly pure story in the sense we are now considering. They are, despite their free use of the supernatural, much closer to the novel, a believed religion, detailed character drawing, and even social satire all come in. The Hobbit escapes the danger of degenerating into mere plot and excitement by a very curious shift of tone. As the humor and homeliness of the early chapters, the sheer hobby try, dies away, we pass insensibly into the world of epic. It is as if the Battle of Toad Hall had become a serious Hamesock and Badger had begun to talk like Enjol. Thus we lose one theme but find another. We kill, but not the same fox. It may be asked why anyone should be encouraged to write a form in which the means are apparently so often at war with the end. But I am hardly suggesting that anyone who can write great poetry should write stories instead. I am rather suggesting what those whose work will in any case be a romance should aim at. And I do not think it unimportant that good work in this kind, even work less than perfectly good, can come where poetry will never come. Shall I be thought whimsical if, in conclusion, I suggest that this internal tension in the heart of every story between the theme and the plot constitutes, after all, its chief resemblance to life? If story fails in that way, does not life commit the same blunder? In real life, as in a story, something must happen. This is just the trouble. We grasp at a state and find only a succession of events in which the state is never quite embodied. The grand idea of finding Atlantis which stirs us in the first chapter of the adventure story is apt to be frittered away in mere excitement when the journey has once been begun. But so, in real life, the idea of adventure fades when the day-to-day details begin to happen. Nor is this merely because actual hardship and danger shoulder it aside. Other grand ideas, homecoming, reunion with a beloved, similarly elude our grasp. Suppose there is no disappointment, even so, well, you are here. But now, something must happen, and after that something else. All that happens may be delightful, but can any such series quite embody the sheer state of being which was what we wanted? If the author's plot is only a net, and usually an imperfect one, a net of time and event for catching what is not really a process at all, is life much more? I am not sure, on second thoughts, that the slow fading of the magic in the well at the world's end is, after all, a blemish. It is an image of the truth. Art, indeed, may be expected to do what life cannot do, but so it has done. The bird has escaped us. But it was at least entangled in the net for several chapters. We saw it close and enjoyed the plumage. How many real lives have nets that can do as much? In life and art both, as it seems to me, we are always trying to catch in our net of successive moments something that is not successive. Whether in real life there is any doctor who can teach us how to do it, so that at last either the meshes will become fine enough to hold the bird, or we be so changed that we can throw our nets away and follow the bird to its own country, is not a question for this essay. But I think it is sometimes done, or very, very nearly done, in stories. I believe the effort to be well worth making. 86 on the reading of old books. There is a strange idea abroad that in every subject the ancient books should be read only by the professionals, and that the amateur should content himself with the modern books. Thus I have found as a tutor in English literature that if the average student wants to find out something about Platonism, the very last thing he thinks of doing is to take a translation of Plato off the library shelf and read the Symposium. He would rather read some dreary modern book 10 times as long, all about isms and influences and only once in 12 pages telling him what Plato actually said. The error is rather an amiable one, for it springs from humility. The student is half afraid to meet one of the great philosophers face to face. He feels himself inadequate and thinks he will not understand him. But if he only knew, the great man, just because of his greatness, is much more intelligible than his modern commentator. The simplest student will be able to understand, if not all, yet a very great deal of what Plato said, but hardly anyone can understand some modern books on Platonism. It has always therefore been one of my main endeavors as a teacher to persuade the young that first-hand knowledge is not only more worth acquiring than second-hand knowledge, but is usually much easier and more delightful to acquire. This mistaken preference for the modern books and this shyness of the old ones is nowhere more rampant than in theology. Wherever you find a little study circle of Christian laity you can be almost certain that they are studying not St. Luke or St. Paul or St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or Hooker or Butler, but M. Berdyaev or M. Maritain or Mr. Niebuhr or Miss Sayers or even myself. Now this seems to me topsy-turvy. Naturally, since I myself am a writer, I do not wish the ordinary reader to read no modern books. But if he must read only the new or only the old, I would advise him to read the old. And I would give him this advice precisely because he is an amateur and therefore much less protected than the expert against the dangers of an exclusive contemporary diet. A new book is still on its trial and the amateur is not in a position to judge it. It has to be tested against the great body of Christian thought down the ages, and all its hidden implications, often unsuspected by the author himself, have to be brought to light. Often it cannot be fully understood without the knowledge of a good many other modern books. If you join at 11 o'clock a conversation which began at 8 you will often not see the real bearing of what is said. Remarks which seem to you very ordinary will produce laughter or irritation and you will not see why, the reason, of course, being that the earlier stages of the conversation have given them a special point. In the same way sentences in a modern book which look quite ordinary may be directed at some other book, in this way you may be led to accept what you would have indignantly rejected if you knew its real significance. The only safety is to have a standard of plain, central Christianity, mere Christianity as Baxter called it, which puts the controversies of the moment in their proper perspective. Such a standard can be acquired only from the old books. It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones. Every age has its own outlook. It is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And that means the old books. All contemporary writers share to some extent the contemporary outlook, even those, like myself, who seem most opposed to it. Nothing strikes me more when I read the controversies of past ages than the fact that both sides were usually assuming without question a good deal which we should now absolutely deny. They thought that they were as completely opposed as two sides could be, but in fact they were all the time secretly united with each other and against earlier and later ages, by a great mass of common assumptions. We may be sure that the characteristic blindness of the 20th century, the blindness about which posterity will ask, but how could they have thought that? Lies where we have never suspected it, and concerns something about which there is untroubled agreement between Hitler and President Roosevelt. Note, this was written in 1943, or between Mr. H.G. Wells and Karl Barth. None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it, and weaken our guard against it, if we read only modern books. Where they are true they will give us truths which we half knew already. Where they are false they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can be done only by reading old books. Not, of course, that there is any magic about the past. People were no cleverer then than they are now, they made as many mistakes as we. But not the same mistakes. They will not flatter us in the errors we are already committing, and their own errors, being now open and palpable, will not endanger us. 2 heads are better than 1, not because either is infallible, but because they are unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. To be sure, the books of the future would be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately we cannot get at them. I myself was first led into reading the Christian classics, almost accidentally, as a result of my English studies. Some, such as Hooker, Herbert, Traherne, Taylor, and Bunyan, I read because they are themselves great English writers. Others, such as Boethius. Note, Boethius was born about AD 470 and wrote The Consolation of Philosophy, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas and Dante, because they were influences. George MacDonald I had found for myself at the age of 16 and never wavered in my allegiance, though I tried for a long time to ignore his Christianity. They are, you will note, a mixed bag, representative of many churches, climates, and ages. And that brings me to yet another reason for reading them. The divisions of Christendom are undeniable and are by some of these writers most fiercely expressed. But if any man is tempted to think, as one might be tempted who read only contemporaries, that Christianity is a word of so many meanings that it means nothing at all, he can learn beyond all doubt, by stepping out of his own century, that this is not so. Measured against the ages, mere Christianity turns out to be no insipid interdenominational transparency, but something positive, self-consistent, and inexhaustible. I know it, indeed, to my cost. In the days when I still hated Christianity, note, those who wish to know more about this period should read Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy, The Shape of My Early Life, London 1955, I learned to recognize, like some all too familiar smell, that almost unvarying something which met me, now in Puritan Bunyan, now in Anglican Hooker, now in Thomas Dante. It was there, honeyed and floral, in Francois de Sales, it was there, grave and homely, in Spencer and Walton, it was there, grim but manful, in Pascal and Johnson, there again, with a mild, frightening, paradisial flavor, in Vaughan and Boma and Traherne. In the urban sobriety of the 18th century one was not safe, Law and Butler were 2 lions in the path. The supposed paganism of the Elizabethans could not keep it out, it lay in wait where a man might have supposed himself safest, in the very center of the Fairy Queen and the Arcadia, note, by Sir Philip Sidney, 1554-86. It was, of course, varied, and yet, after all, so unmistakably the same, recognizable, not to be evaded, the odor which is death to us until we allow it to become life, an air that kills. From yon far country blows. Note, A.E. Houseman, a Shropshire lad, London, 1896, stanza 40. We are all rightly distressed, and ashamed also, at the divisions of Christendom. But those who have always lived within the Christian fold may be too easily dispirited by them. They are bad, but such people do not know what it looks like from without. Seen from there, what is left intact despite all the divisions, still appears, as it truly is, an immensely formidable unity. I know, for I saw it, and well our enemies know it. That unity any of us can find by going out of his own age. It is not enough, but it is more than you had thought till then. Once you are well soaked in it, if you then venture to speak, you will have an amusing experience. You will be thought a papist when you are actually reproducing Bunyan, a pantheist when you are quoting Aquinas, and so forth. For you have now got onto the great level viaduct which crosses the ages and which looks so high from the valleys, so low from the mountains, so narrow compared with the swamps, and so broad compared with the sheep tracks. The present book, note, this paper was originally published as an introduction to St. Athanasius the Incarnation of the Word of God, translated by a religious of CSMB. London 1944, is something of an experiment. The translation is intended for the world at large, not only for theological students. If it succeeds, other translations of other great Christian books will presumably follow. In one sense, of course, it is not the first in the field. Translations of the Theologia Germanica, note, a late 14th century anonymous mystical treatise, The Imitation, note, The Imitation of Christ, a manual of spiritual devotion first put into circulation in 1418. The authorship has traditionally been assigned to Thomas A. Kempis, c. 1380-1471, The Scale of Perfection, note, by Walter Hilton, d. 1396, and The Revelations of Lady Julian of Norwich, note, 16 Revelations of Divine Love by Lady Julian of Norwich, c. 1342 after 1413, are already on the market, and are very valuable, though some of them are not very scholarly. But it will be noticed that these are all books of devotion rather than of doctrine. Now the layman or amateur needs to be instructed as well as to be exhorted. In this age his need for knowledge is particularly pressing. Nor would I admit any sharp division between the two kinds of book. For my own part, I tend to find the doctrinal books often more helpful in devotion than the devotional books, and I rather suspect that the same experience may await many others. I believe that many who find that nothing happens when they sit down, or kneel down, to a book of devotion, would find that the heart sings unbidden while they are working their way through a tough bit of theology with a pipe in their teeth and a pencil in their hand. This is a good translation of a very great book. St. Athanasius has suffered in popular estimation from a certain sentence in the Athanasian Creed, note, a profession of faith widely used in Western Christendom, and also known from its opening words as the quick unfold. I will not labor the point that that work is not exactly a creed and was not by St. Athanasius, for I think it is a very fine piece of writing. The words which faith except every one do keep whole and undefiled, without doubt he shall perish everlastingly are the offense. They are commonly misunderstood. The operative word is keep, not acquire, or even believe, but keep. The author, in fact, is not talking about unbelievers, but about deserters, not about those who have never heard of Christ, nor even those who have misunderstood and refused to accept him, but of those who having really understood and really believed, then allow themselves, under the sway of sloth or of fashion or any other invited confusion, to be drawn away into sub-Christian modes of thought. They are a warning against the curious modem assumption that all changes of belief, however brought about, are necessarily exempt from blame, note, see Hebrews 6:4 ETSEQ. But this is not my immediate concern. I mention the creed, commonly called, of St. Athanasius only to get out of the reader's way what may have been a bogey and to put the true Athanasius in its place. His epitaph is Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. We are proud that our own country has more than once stood against the world. Athanasius did the same. He stood for the Trinitarian doctrine, whole and undefiled, when it looked as if all the civilized world was slipping back from Christianity into the religion of Arius. Note, Arius, c.250, c.336, the champion of subordinationist teaching about the person of Christ, into one of those sensible synthetic religions which are so strongly recommended today and which, then as now, included among their devotees many highly cultivated clergymen. It is his glory that he did not move with the times, it is his reward that he now remains when those times, as all times do, have moved away. When I first opened his De Incarnatione I soon discovered by a very simple test that I was reading a masterpiece. I knew very little Christian Greek except that of the New Testament, and I had expected difficulties. To my astonishment I found it almost as easy as Xenophon, and only a master mind could, in the 4th century, have written so deeply on such a subject with such classical simplicity. Every page I read confirmed this impression. His approach to the miracles is badly needed today, for it is the final answer to those who object to them as arbitrary and meaningless violations of the laws of nature. Note, a few years after this was written, Lewis himself wrote an admirable defense, Miracles, a preliminary study, London 1947. They are here shown to be rather the retelling in capital letters of the same message which nature writes in her crabbed cursive hand, the very operations one would expect of him who was so full of life that when he wished to die he had to borrow death from others. The whole book, indeed, is a picture of the tree of life, a sappy and golden book, full of buoyancy and confidence. We cannot, I admit, appropriate all its confidence today. We cannot point to the high virtue of Christian living and the gay, almost mocking courage of Christian martyrdom, as a proof of our doctrines with quite that assurance which Athanasius takes as a matter of course. But whoever may be to blame for that, it is not Athanasius.